Thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you, Tara, for that introduction. My name is Howard Schiffman. I'm a visiting professor in the Environmental Conservation Education program here at NYU's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. I'd like to also thank our host this evening, the NYU Office of Sustainability, especially Tara and her team, and the Wallerstein Collaborative as well. The event which inspired tonight's program was not a pleasant one for any of us here in New York, but one that we must learn from. And just as the events of 9/11 brought us to a new normal from how we get on airplanes to how we conduct our foreign policy, so too are Katrina, Sandy, and future superstorms likely to change life in America. As concerned citizens, we need to think of these impacts at the international, national, municipal, and community levels. As members of the New York City and NYU communities, we need to think about how we will respond to these challenges at the local level. Can we achieve sustainability in the face of worsening weather and climate? A few items for us to ponder on how life may change. First, it has long been desirable to live near water. Will the experience of Superstorm Sandy, if perhaps coupled with other future superstorms where surges can be expected, change this aspect of real estate practice? Second, many drivers of gas-guzzling cars and SUVs do not recall the gas rationing and attendant gas lines of the 1970s. I do. Will the short experience with gas rationing that we experienced here in the Northeast in the aftermath of Sandy change consumer choices in automobiles? To widen our perspective, our event tonight occurs in the immediate aftermath of the Doha climate negotiations. With only modest, and many would say disappointing outcomes at best, in the realm of climate mitigation, it falls to vulnerable communities such as coastal municipalities to adapt and prepare as best they can. I feel it necessary to mention that small island developing states and coastal areas in developing countries face even greater risks than cities like New York. Along those lines, Haiti, Cuba, and other countries also experienced devastating effects from Hurricane Sandy. One of our themes this evening will be the value of education as a tool to achieve sustainability and build resilience and adaptation in our communities. We all have a responsibility to learn and adapt to prepare the next generation for extreme weather events and climate change. Governments and NGOs have responsibilities, but so do all citizens. Educators have a special responsibility in this regard. Our esteemed panel this evening will help us make sense of these challenges and discuss some of the important work being done in the public and private sector to help us all adapt to life after Sandy, the new normal. Thank you. In the interest of time, I will not read the full speaker biographies as they're on the Sustainability Office website, but they are available for you to review if you want to. Our first speaker this evening is Leah Cohen from the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. Thank you, Leah.
Okay, hi there. So as Howard said, I'm Leah Cohen. I'm a policy advisor in climate resilience in the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability. And for those of you who may not know, we're the office that is charged with coordinating and overseeing implementation of Plan YC, which is Mayor Bloomberg's long-term sustainability plan. That's something that was launched in 2007. We just updated it again in 2011, and it includes climate change, both mitigation in terms of efforts to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but also efforts to increase our resilience. And so that's kind of my piece of the work, is working with a lot of city agencies and outside stakeholders to really think about and develop a city response to increase our resilience. And I want to recognize actually Ray Zimmerman, who is a member of our New York City panel on climate change, which is our body of climate and impact scientists that helped us develop New York City specific projections. So I just wanted to start out today by kind of giving you the context in terms of what it was like to work at the city during Sandy, talk a little bit about some of the other impacts that we face in terms of climate risks, and what our future holds in store for us based on what the New York City panel on climate change has said. And then I'll just talk a little bit about what we've been doing, and then kind of what the mayoral and city response is going to be for the rest of the term, all 344 days that we have left. So So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what it was like to be at the city, I personally am also part of the mayor's operations team. So we were part of this group of people during the storm that were mobilized and sent to the Emergency Operations Center. And we spent, I would say, about 3.5 weeks really focused around all the energy issues. My boss was the one reporting to the mayor every morning how many people had lost power, how many people were still out of heat, what was going on with the fuel situation. We had to really figure out a lot of different things on the fly. So it was an incredible experience to be thrown in the middle of. So I think, the story that we learned from Sandy was we live in a very interdependent situation. Sandy was the highest recorded storm surge we've ever had in New York City. We had about 14 feet at the Battery, which is 3.5 to 4 feet higher than has ever been recorded in the past. So an unprecedented event. It led to, I think, almost 700,000 customers losing power. And we really started to realize kind of what that means across the city. You had all of a sudden huge, gas and electric networks that were offline. We also had a number of different buildings that were damaged. We had to evacuate 5 hospitals. This is something that's probably very near and dear to a lot of people here, given that you guys were kind of at ground zero, so to speak, of a lot of the impacts of the storm. And we really started to kind of understand what happens when your power goes out and your transit systems are shut down. All of a sudden, now everybody needs to drive. Your fuel terminals are damaged, your refineries are damaged, and now you have a fuel shortage. You've got people that have had to be evacuated from hospitals who you're trying to care for. We had, people trapped. I'm sure everybody read in the news. We had, people trapped in buildings that had lost power and weren't getting water above the 6th floor. And we suddenly had, a lot of public health and other safety challenges on our hands. So, I think that really brought home a lot of the things that we had been thinking about as a city in terms of resilience for a long time, and is something that is certainly going to, wholesale change the focus and perspective of this administration, at least for the end of the term and hopefully for a long time moving forward. In addition to thinking about coastal storms, I think it's important to remember that we also face a lot of impacts from other extreme climate events. People may not know, we've got heat waves every year, many of them. They affect the entire city. In fact, we had 140 deaths from the 2006 heat wave, which is about 4 times as many people as died during Hurricane Sandy. So just to give you a sense, there are other impacts that we face. Extreme rainfall causes turbidity events, which basically means that it rains really hard in our watershed upstate, and that causes a lot of problems for water quality. We've invested a lot as a city to try to protect our water supply, so you probably haven't noticed. You still see clean water coming out of your tap, but those are the types of events that we're going to have to be dealing with on a more regular basis moving forward. So the New York City Panel on Climate Change, this panel of climate scientists that we convened in 2008 to develop projections for the city, has given us a sense of, just what the future holds in store for us. We know that a lot of these events are going to become more frequent and more severe. They're saying that we could experience up to 2.5 feet of sea level rise between now and mid-century. We could have 2 to 3 times as many heat waves as we have now, as many 90-degree days as Charleston, South Carolina. So just to give you a sense, our climate is changing, and it's changing pretty quickly. So what has the city been doing to respond to some of this stuff? As I mentioned, Plan YC has really been sort of the city's umbrella for coordinating our efforts to increase resilience. In 2007, we committed to reducing our greenhouse gas 30% by 2030, and we also, at the same time, convened this panel on climate change to help us better understand what the impacts are that we were going to face in the future, and then start to address them. And so at that point, we had convened a task force called the Climate Adaptation Task Force. That's something that I chair. And that's really made up of a bunch of different infrastructure operators, both city agencies, but also public and private operators. You know, the MTA, Con Ed, Verizon, all of the main culprits in this last event, to start to think through, you know, what were the impacts and how could they start to address them. And so that's been a 3.5-year process with them. We did a very qualitative vulnerability assessment at first, but more recently we've been working to really quantify what the impacts are of these different events so that they could start to measure the costs avoided. Because in a lot of cases, what we're dealing with are going to be incremental changes in the way that we, you know, design and build our infrastructure. And, you know, up until Sandy, I think we were really working to find ways to convince people that these investments were worth it. So there's a lot of work that has been going on related to infrastructure. In addition, the city's doing a whole host of things to make sure that that our infrastructure, the infrastructure we control, is protected, and that includes things like our green infrastructure plan, which this group may have heard about. We're basically investing $1.5 billion to reduce the impact of heavy rainfall and CSO events on the city by installing, you know, bioswales and other things like that. In addition, you know, we've also been doing a lot of stuff to increase the resilience of the built environment, and I think luckily we saw with this storm that some of that stuff has paid off. You know, we've been requiring projects for a while as part of our environmental review to start to consider sea level rise. So you see projects like Willets Point redevelopment, which got raised up out of the floodplain. You see projects like Sims Recycling Center, which also got raised out of the floodplain, faring pretty well. You know, Sims was right next to other facilities that didn't do so well. So I think the good news is that, you know, we've been starting to actually require that some of these things are included in our development, and that's paying off. We've also been working to start to update our building code to require more stringent flood protection standards. And that includes both working with FEMA to update the flood maps, which determine, you know, which buildings across the city have to comply with flood protection standards, and then also who has insurance, but at the same time also updating our building code. And then the final area is sort of thinking about, you know, waterfront and coastal protection more broadly. And so to do that, we've been working with the Army Corps of Engineers. I guess 1 week before the storm, we actually sent a letter to them requesting formal assistance for a large-scale study, the types of studies that have been done in New Orleans post-Katrina, to start to think about, you know, what are citywide protection solutions for the city. So that's just a flavor of some of the stuff that we've been doing. Last week, Mayor Bloomberg announced the city's response to resilience post-Sandy. And so a lot of that work that we've been doing, we're now accelerating and putting on a much faster time span. So what he committed to in that speech was really to accelerate our updates to the building code and these flood zone maps so that we make sure that we're informing rebuilding in a smarter and stronger way. And then also he announced the creation of essentially a new body under Seth Pinsky, who's currently our head of our our Economic Development Corporation, to really head up community recovery and rebuilding, but also to set the stage for resilience moving forward. And so part of that work is going to include working with infrastructure operators to start to set design standards or performance standards for what New Yorkers can come to expect about how their infrastructure should perform in some of these events. And it also is going to include a lot of work around the built environment with something called the Buildings Resilience Task Force, which is going to be looking at really how we start to protect our building systems and our existing buildings moving forward. So I think there's a lot more discussion to be had. I apologize, I've gone over my time, but I'm looking forward to the conversation today, and I think this is really important because up until now, the city's really been engaging heavily with the infrastructure folks. We haven't spent as much time talking with those in the buildings community, and then particularly, at universities and institutions like NYU. So obviously, we learned from the storm that if you don't think about some of the issues on the building side, you're going to have a lot of problems. And so this is going to be a really important partnership for us moving forward.
Perfect.
Thank you, Leah. Our next speaker is Jeremy Friedman from the NYU Office of Sustainability.
I'll go ahead and stand up anyway.
You got it?
Got it. Yep, got it. Thank you. Okay, that's a perfect segue to maybe some of what I can share. And as much as anything else, I just want to set the stage for some of the other conversations that are going to happen tonight. I want to just zoom in for a moment, take us down to the level of our immediate built environment and the experiences of some of the folks involved in New York University's response during and immediately after the storm. And from there, you sort of use that as a jumping off point for highlighting some of the opportunities for the future that we've identified as an institution in the city. And some of the ways that that I'm seeing anyway from the vantage point of the Sustainability Office that there's a relationship, a dynamic relationship that emerges between institutions and cities where we have an opportunity to really help all of the processes that Leah was sharing kind of move forward effectively and hopefully more quickly. The urgency surrounding issues of climate change is not something we can trumpet enough. And most of the time, before now, if I've been speaking in front of a group of folks in the university, I've been talking about climate mitigation. I've been talking about preventing global warming, preventing the worst excesses, at least more recently is all I get to say. Maybe earlier when I first started speaking about this, I got to talk about preventing climate change. But it's very much a conversation about what is NYU doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to head this train off at the pass, basically. What's interesting for me in this conversation tonight is that I have to make a pivot as the Sustainability Office representative in being able to talk not only about mitigation, but about adaptation to climate change. What was both interesting to me and maybe, I guess, relatively convenient, since I got to bring some of the same remarks, is that the lesson that we've really taken away at NYU has been that so much of what we have tried to do so far and what we want to do to mitigate climate change dovetails with what we need to do to adapt to its worst effects. And that the two elements are really part and parcel. So what we're learning is that we don't need to change our plans or go in a completely new direction to do this, but we need to think about adaptation and moving the exact same direction we were trying to move as an institution already. And that's been really interesting. So just to kind of take us in. So as the storm unfolded, some folks in the New York University community would find on the ground here that there were very few buildings you would see in the distance lit up between Battery Park and Midtown. And that remarkably, portions of the university in the core central campus were able to maintain basic vital services, shelter, heat, light, to many members of the community, thanks to the cogeneration power plant, which exists beneath our feet at West 4th and Mercer Street, right near here, and is one of the larger and kind of more muscular sources of energy in Lower Manhattan. The cogen plant project was developed as an efficiency project. It was developed in conjunction with the university making announcements in a commitment to sustainability, to developing a climate action plan, establishing targets for reducing climate change, reducing global warming emissions by, in an agreement with the mayor's office, 30% by 2017, and 40%, and 100% by 2040. And the cogen plant was also going to help us achieve various kinds of operational efficiency benefits, cost savings, other kinds of measures. That was really the message that we took to the community in developing this project, and it went online in 2011. Of course, what we found out is that this 13 megawatt power plant didn't just have performance benefits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and again, trying to head off that train at the pass, but that this plant was the difference maker in us being able to support a portion of our community's power and heat and sort of critical needs at a time when they really weren't possible anywhere else. So this mitigation measure was a resiliency measure as well. This was true in less obvious ways because a lot has been made of that particular project. It's a $125 million scale investment. It's a very large project, but what's been interesting at that large scale has been true at the small is beautiful scale as well. So during the crisis and immediately after the crisis, really, NYU's a very nimble and small program that we run out of the Office of Sustainability turned out to be very useful. We have a 75 bicycle bike sharing program for students, faculty, and staff in the university. It's the only currently operating bike share program in the city, and something that the City Department of Transportation has been able to look at as the city tries to move forward with a larger scale project. What happened is as traffic snarled, as public transit systems remained down in the days following the storm, we had staff on campus in facilities and public safety and critical life safety functions who needed to be able to get around. We're a big place. And we were able to repurpose all of those bike share bikes and kind of set up an emergency center for just getting everybody moving and able to get from one place to another, even to get into those gas lines and come back with fuel to run generators or run vehicles. So the bike share was actually the kind of unintended consequence we want, the positive unintended consequence. And it really spoke to the idea of the sustainability precautionary principle, that something, again, that we saw as a measure that was for going green was also a measure for adapting to the consequences of our environmental crisis. We saw this not just operationally, but programmatically as well. Student volunteerism rates were off the charts at NYU. The emergency response of the community of people who call this university home was very much self-organized. Not all those plans existed in advance. We wish they had, and we may be able to make those things more possible. But in the same way that we saw Occupy Sandy deploy itself into the Rockaways and kind of nimbly fill a gap in the human side of response, that was something we were able to see here. And just yesterday, the university announced an administrative leave policy for staff members, that permanent full-time employees with at least 6 months of university employment are actually going to be eligible in 2013 to take 15 work days, up to 15 work days, to volunteer time with recognized organizations that are working to address the aftermath of Sandy. And that really struck me also as helpful, because it continues to make that sustainability resilience connection. So across the board, whether it was through these sort of operational or these programmatic impacts, we saw some of the first steps or the first ways that we have an opportunity as an institution to model and to support activities that happen at a city level. We see institutions like NYU as players that can be useful in terms of proof of concept of nimble new programs, ways to pilot test, and also as, when they are aggregated, as allies that can together at scale really help a city respond to a crisis. And going forward, there will have to be a lot more discussions about what types of plans and strategies NYU can implement in terms of adaptation and crisis management. But whether it's our continued commitment to energy conservation, to efficiency measures, and to drawing down our actual demand on a grid, that's a mitigation effort, but it's an adaptation one. We're building even, I mean, it also applies to our academic mission. So there are, for right now, for example, just to throw a few things out there and leave that as a seed that we can maybe discuss further, the Institute for Public Knowledge has quick response research grants that they're giving out to graduate students and faculty to gather data, really essential immediate data about some of the different affected communities responding to Sandy. And students and faculty are stepping up and actually grabbing these small grants to sort of just get on the ground and implement projects. And we're having in-class discussions with many of the faculty and students in courses to understand what they can be doing to be more involved. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Constantine Contacosta from the NYU Center for the Sustainable Built Environment and NYU CUSP.
Thanks, Howard. Okay, so this is probably the picture that Jeremy was referring to. So, welcome. It's a pleasure to be here. I am started with at NYU with the Shack Institute of Real Estate, where I created something called the Center for the Sustainable Built Environment, which basically studies sustainable building policy and finance. And I mentioned that only because it got off the ground 2 years ago thanks to a program that Jeremy created called the Green Grants, and provided some seed funding to actually convince some of the administration that would be a smart move, give me a little flexibility. So it's now grown on to go from his seed grant to about 20 times in funding. So it's been great, and certainly a testament to the Green Grant program. Most of my time now, though, is spent with the Center for Urban Science and Progress, which is NYU's new Applied Sciences campus that came out of Bloomberg's Applied Sciences Initiative. So Cornell Technion was the first winner. We were the second winner. We don't consider ourselves second place, we just came later. So it's a unique partnership of 6 universities led by NYU. We have 12 industrial partners led by IBM and Cisco, and a number of others who are expressing interest. We actually have the national labs now involved. Lawrence Livermore National Lab is a partner in what we're doing. They have, to give you an estimate of why we're involving them, not only for their scientists, but also for the fact that they have the number 3 fastest computing capability in the country. So tremendous resources, and most importantly, we have partnerships with 13 agencies in the MTA and the Port Authority. So these are direct relationships where we have access to city data, city personnel, city problems, so we could work directly with them, unlocking these big data analytics and big data and informatics to address urban problems and to improve quality of life in cities. So just in terms of how this fits in terms of how we're looking at some of the work that I'm doing in terms of research, fits in back to resilience. First thing is definitions are very important. We have to be very precise in how we talk about things. And this is something that's come up in the green building world for anybody who's been in that space. There's been a lot of ambiguity about what sustainability means, and that's led to greenwashing and other kind of complacency around what people are talking about. So there's a lot of elements here. There's adaptability, there's hardening, there's preparedness, there's response, there's resilience. So each of these things has a different policy response, has different implications for individual human behavior, for social behavior. So we need to be really kind of precise in how we're looking at that. But resilience, we're really talking about the ability to respond to a shock, to some sort of additional strain being placed on a system. And I think this is very telling here in that, if you think about New York, New Yorkers are very resilient. Right? Any native New Yorkers in the room? Got a handful. Okay, good. It's the cool crowd hanging out in the back. New Yorkers are resilient because they're tough, because they deal with strain every day. We deal with congestion and other kinds of problems that people from other parts of the country and the world think we're crazy to deal with. But we do it because there's opportunities here, because there's nightlife here, because there's cultural amenities here, because there's other benefits of people living close together in a place like New York City. But this also prepares us to deal with hardship more. Now, that's on the average, right? Now, this is a problem we deal with all the time. And when we start talking about data, it always comes to statistics. And when you talk about the average person or you respond to the average community, then everyone will fail. But what we're talking about really, especially, is the vulnerability, right? So the ability to respond to a shock is directly a function of your capacity to deal with extra strain. And so anybody knows that if you're dealing with a sick family member and you're dealing with debt, and then all of a sudden you lose your house, you don't have a capacity to respond the same way that somebody who might have $100,000 in the bank does. So this is an important consideration in terms of who we're dealing with, in terms of understanding the populations and how they're individually affected. Now, New Yorkers are great, but like most people, we have our flaws. One, of course, is our complete denial of predictions. We don't believe them, right? We root for the underdog in the Super Bowl, and when they tell us to leave our houses, we say, no, it's never going to happen. It didn't happen last time. So one of the things we're trying to do with CUSP is improve this ability to predict, to model and understand how different effects, and whether it be a hurricane or another natural disaster, or any number of things, how the future might actually play out. And I bring up this slide for two reasons. Well, for a number of reasons. But one is looking at Battery Park City, which you can see is still lit up there. The main reason why is that Con Ed preemptively shut down power stations and didn't do that because the one feeding Battery Park City is on higher ground. So they left that running. But the other part of it, and this is to Jeremy's point, is that a lot of the buildings, the Battery Park City has very stringent requirements in terms of design guidelines and require adaptability, require energy efficiency in their design guidelines. So 3 key buildings there built by the Albanese organization. They're all LEED certified residential buildings. They all have their mechanical equipment on the roof. Right? So they have, even if the power had gone out, even when the water came through, they had the protection there of those mechanical equipments being on the roof rather than being flooded in the basement. So this is very important as we think about new policies, especially around building codes, that we stress the evidence behind it. We stress kind of the prediction, the modeling, and what we're seeing with the energy efficiency space, just like climate change in general, is that people are very loath to believe what may happen 20 years, 5 years in the future when their investment horizon or their decision horizon is more 6 months, a year. So I think there's the same combination here about improving that predictability and the reliability will actually improve how people make decisions. Along those lines, there's a fundamental effort here that you can't improve what you can't measure. You're not going to improve what you can't value. Right. So therefore, you can't value what you can't measure, and you're in a bind. And valuation here is an important consideration. The moralistic arguments around energy efficiency have largely failed. The moralistic arguments around climate change have largely failed. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we need to tap into ways to actually think about how people make decisions, and particularly investment decisions. And this isn't just big banks making decisions or large real estate owners making decisions. It's how individuals make decisions on where they buy a home, for instance, or how much they care about hardening their own infrastructure in terms of their home. So one of the things you'll see is Lower Manhattan. 12% of the commercial office space in Manhattan is still vacant, is still offline. So you're talking about buildings that rent at $100, $150 a square foot, companies that are producing thousands of dollars of output per square foot. It's a huge economic impact. But we haven't really been able to value that or capture that, and certainly haven't adapted that into our prediction models for looking at vulnerable communities, because there's an economic vulnerability and, of course, a social vulnerability component of this as well. And I'll just close with another thing that we're trying to use in terms of this informatics and really understanding how better information can improve how people live in the city, and understanding the flows of people, how people move around in a city, how people make decisions and connect within a city. I think it's very telling, not so much from here, although it applies in Lower Manhattan, but much more in Brooklyn and Staten Island, where people were much harder hit, is that we had these very robust social networks that sprung to action, right, that were predicated on other needs, just survival needs, just in kind of general case. But these social networks provided an important safety net in terms of the resilience. But what we also saw was a strong disconnect between that and the kind of institutional response of the city. So the government wanted to help, wanted to deploy its resources efficiently, but there were some disconnects in kind of communicating what was going on and how people were getting information and that two-way flow of information. So Leah mentioned the importance of understanding the kind of reporting on electricity outages and fuel oil problems on a day-to-day basis. That data is surprisingly hard to get. I mean, Con Ed provides it. National Grid is a little tougher on the gas side. But things like, for example, people who had electricity but whose boilers were broken and the landlords wouldn't repair them and they didn't have heat. So that kind of information, the real dynamic channel was only a 311 kind of report. There's got to be a better way of assessing and understanding what's happening on the ground and how that connects back. And that will really strengthen the kind of overall urban resilience and city resilience when you can connect the local social networks, like what we saw, the NYU response of the students here, with the institutional response of the city government. So this is an important connection and something that we're trying to do in terms of how we're approaching this idea of informatics and big data and how we're applying it to urban problems. So thank you.
Thank you, Constantine. Our next speaker is Carlos Restrepo from the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service.
Okay, thank you and welcome. I would like to speak a little bit about climate change adaptation, and in particular the role that an institution like NYU can play in terms of providing input, not just to climate change adaptation, but also how to look at how to include climate change adaptation within the sustainability framework. All the data that we've seen recently suggests that greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow, even at rates that are higher than what scientists feel comfortable with, instead of predicting a 2 degrees centigrade increase in average temperatures. And so that definitely highlights the need for continued efforts in terms of climate change mitigation. But that also tells us that we really have to think hard about climate change adaptation as well. And I think that, as Jeremy said, that in his office they have focused mostly on mitigation and thinking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's also the case that in education, in a lot of our courses, we tend to focus a lot on greenhouse gas mitigation and a lot less on climate change adaptation, which for certain professions like urban planning and public policy will become, I think, increasingly important in the next few decades for sure. So some of the things that we can do is to try to adapt our infrastructure systems, and I think that this process of adaptation also provides some very good opportunities to think about other dimensions that we tend to think about as part of sustainable development, like the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of development projects. So I'd just like to show some examples. This picture shows a climate change adaptation project by the MTA. It's a structure that you see here designed to raise the level of the grates on the sidewalk that provide vents for the subway system. This is along the F line in Queens. For those of you who are familiar, it's on Hillside Avenue and Parsons Boulevard. And if you walk along that street, you see that there are several of these structures that have been put in place. They come in different configurations and sizes. The design of the structure is supposed to reference waves and water and what it's designed to protect the infrastructure from, which I think is a very interesting use of design. And for the ones like these that are right next to a bus stop, they have provided structures that can allow people to sit, maybe while they're waiting for the bus to come. And I think that what's interesting about this is that it highlights some of the potential opportunities to think not just about adaptation to climate change, but also some other things that we can think about related to infrastructure, like, for example, making the quality of the ride more attractive so that people will want to use public transportation more, maybe thinking about improving design to make quality of life better for these communities. And so I think that these kinds of dimensions, which we think of in the context of sustainability, should also be included in our attempts to also address climate change adaptation, in particular of infrastructure systems. Other examples, these are just some pictures from the roof right above us in this building. There's been quite a lot of debate about what to do with buildings, in particular in dense urban areas, which already contribute, because of the way the built environment absorbs and releases heat, in terms of raising average temperatures compared to, say, rural areas. As Leah mentioned, global climate change is not just about storms, but one of the things that we can expect is definitely higher temperatures and more heat wave type events. And so, instituting measures that can reduce the heat associated with buildings is not only desirable from a climate change mitigation, since reducing the temperature of buildings reduces the need for temperature control, but also adaptation as well, if we're expecting higher temperatures. And so in the city, you now have ordinances for new developments or redevelopments to at least include light or white surfaces that reflect a lot of radiation so that the building doesn't absorb it. And of course, other places are going for things like green roofs. So one of the things to do is to think about some of the trade-offs between these systems and which systems are more efficient in terms of energy savings. There are some studies, for example, done in Chicago that suggest that this kind of reflective surface is actually more efficient. But of course, a green roof also has additional advantages like stormwater management, which might be more efficient than this kind of system. And it can also provide other services, even habitat for wildlife. I've seen our resident red-tailed hawks use that space, for example. And so there are ways that you can think about even extending that beyond just a green roof. There are efforts around the city to also use those kinds of spaces for things like growing food and urban farming that could conceivably be used as well for creating more green areas and urban parks, in particular for areas that are underserved by parks. So that is also something to think about. And again, something where an institution, a research and education institution like NYU can play an important role. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention was the inclusion of climate change adaptation into the city's environmental quality review process. Again, Leah mentioned earlier that the city's environmental quality review was amended earlier this year. Now it includes climate change. In particular, projects are required to show that they're consistent with city policies in areas like greenhouse gas mitigation. And as you can see from the text here, the issue of climate change adaptation is something that continues to evolve pretty rapidly. There is a lot of work that needs to be done in this area, and so projects are asked to consult with the city on an individual basis to see how that issue should be addressed. And so again, I think there's a lot of opportunity here for sort of collaboration in an institution like NYU, where there's such a great capacity for interdisciplinary research to contribute into what exactly we mean by adaptation, for example, when we're thinking about infrastructure projects that are supposed to be operational for many, many decades. So what does adaptation really mean and how that can be done? And so providing some guidance in terms of what that process should entail, I think is going to be another very important area of work. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Our next speaker is Jennifer Dunn from Architecture for Humanity.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jennifer Dunn. I'm the Managing Director for Architecture for Humanity New York. We're an all-volunteer chapter, and we are the local chapter of Architecture for Humanity, the global organization. So Architecture for Humanity is a nonprofit organization that started in 1999 to promote architectural and design services, getting it to communities in need, other nonprofits, and provide solutions to global social humanitarian crises. This is Kate and Cameron. They founded the organization in 1999 here in New York. The chapter started in 2005 when Kate and Cameron moved to San Francisco, and since then there have been about over 50 chapters founded worldwide. They also won the TED Prize, and the Open Architecture Network was launched, and that is a open community where people can share design, give design, people can go find design, and we also, as an organization, have all of our projects up there and how we've been responding to other issues and how other chapters are working. Architecture for Humanity New York, as I said, is the local chapter of Architecture for Humanity. We work only in the 5 boroughs, and our goal is to provide a platform for professionals who are providing their design services to partner them with other nonprofits and communities in need that need design services that normally wouldn't get them. So, yeah, what we do best, the New York chapter itself has over 1,000 volunteers. We are the largest chapter and the oldest chapter. We typically are working on 8 projects or more at a time, depending on how large the projects are. And we have strong relationships with city agencies, other organizations, other nonprofits, and then also the chapters worldwide. So right after Hurricane Sandy, headquarters launched the Rebuild, Restore, and Renew New York, New Jersey. And right now we currently have 4 projects basically going on. The first one that started was the chapter itself has been doing assessments, and these aren't the typical DOB assessments that are going on, but they're assessments where we're going out into the community, talking to the people and the community, looking for the needs and the social capacities that exist in those communities, and how are they going to be able to rebuild? Do they need us to help them rebuild? And how can we help them rebuild? And we're taking all of that information. We should be completing those by the end of January. I should switch this in. These are all the communities that we're going out into, sending teams to. So we're going to map all of this information and provide that to other organizations that are providing relief and helping rebuild, because as much as we would love to help everybody, we're still a pretty small organization. So we're going to do as much as we can for as many people as we can and share this information with everybody so that we don't lose sight of what is important to people and don't lose sight of the community itself and what made those communities, because it's not just about the buildings. The first major project that headquarters has launched is the Restore the Shore project down in Seaside Heights, New Jersey, and it's a partnership with the city to rebuild. Basically, as headquarters had deployed people from their disaster team to assess the damage in the area, they spoke with the city and basically realized that if Seaside Heights didn't get its boardwalk back and get some of its businesses up and didn't have anything to draw the tourists back, that town economically would have been destroyed. So in partnering with them and MTV, we had a huge fundraiser and were able to raise quite a bit of money. I think it was over $1 million last time I checked, or close to it anyway. And we will be working with them to restore the boardwalks, to restore some of the businesses. We're also looking at environmental issues that are more just typical, not typical I guess, but preventative measures that wouldn't necessarily prevent a hurricane, but how do we look at keeping their beaches from eroding away? Do we install reefs? Do we install jetties? And then as far as like building up sand dunes and stuff like that, that might help mitigate some of the damage that would come from a storm like Sandy. But all of these projects are just in the very beginning stages, so they're really just starting the research now as to what needs to be done and how can it be done right now to help with these issues. The second project is Rebuild One Block out on the Rockaways. Here we're mostly working with individual homeowners, or we will be working with individual homeowners to help, rebuild and really be there to help the clients make smart decisions about how they rebuild or should they rebuild and how can we help them rebuild. Obviously, we'll be working a lot with understanding if there are new building codes or what those will be, and we're waiting to get information from FEMA about what the new floodplain maps are and information like that to help clients understand what they're doing. And then also smart building and green building and sustainable building, like we've been talking about. Should people put solar panels in? Should they be raising everything up? Should there be anything in the basements at all? That's been a huge issue in areas that were not just where the fire was, in general, the flooding in that sense. So all of that stuff is also just starting. And then the last major project that we have is a partnership with Nike to go into schools, and we just started we'll start the assessments tomorrow. Basically, we're going into facilities, public school facilities, their athletic facilities, and we're trying to decide which ones we can really help and which ones need the most help, which communities will be the most impacted by having these facilities restored. So again, it just is starting right now, but we're going to try and one of our goals, at least for those, is to harden these facilities against future damages and potentially make them locations for refugees to go if there is another emergency of any sort or natural disaster, so that those are there for the community. And if it's an outdoor facility like soccer fields or football fields that are really important in being restored, we'll be looking at ways to make sure that whatever happens again in the future, it hopefully doesn't create the same sort of damage. So if it's flooding, can we somehow figure out a way to get some sort of retention ponds in there, or whatever it is right now that we can do to hopefully prevent damage in the future. So, yeah. That's it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Our final speaker this evening with some concluding remarks will be Dr. Mary Liu, my colleague at the Environmental Conservation Education Program and director of the Wallerstein Collaborative for Urban Environmental Education. Thank you, Mary.
Good evening. On behalf of the Wallerstein Collaborative, I would like to thank our panel for bringing their collective expertise to this evening's discussion, and Howard Schiffman, who provided the inspiration for this panel, along with Tara Eisenberg, Jesse Baker, for coordinating and making this event possible. Each of you has helped us develop a deeper understanding of local and global perspectives on the impacts of Sandy and where we go from here. As an educator grounded in the social sciences, I would like to take this opportunity to underscore the importance of education and environmental literacy in addressing the environmental challenges that lie ahead. Clearly, Superstorm Sandy impacted every facet of our life in our city, and we realized just how vulnerable we are and how frail our natural and social systems are, as we heard from our panelists on various perspectives. As we go forward, wise decisions will have to be made on what will be replaced, rebuilt, or relocated, and what will not be. We have all wondered what might happen if we are subjected to more frequent storms of this magnitude. How will we prepare ourselves for the new norm? The aftermath of Sandy will last a very long time, and we will have we'll have to change our policies, redraw our maps, rewrite our textbooks, and rethink our relationship to the natural world and the dynamics of an urban ecosystem in a way that will reduce risk to our well-being. At present, we are a city at risk. As Sandy battered our coastline, streets became rivers and homes became infernos. Schools turned into shelters, tunnels were flooded, power was lost, and our ability to move from one community to another was severely compromised. Our neighbors became environmental refugees, and the world as we knew it changed. We need to think about the physical infrastructure, but at the same time, we need to consider the impact of Sandy on our social infrastructure and the impact this has had on communities both rich and poor. From a social justice perspective, there is much that we need to do and improve on to protect our most vulnerable citizens, children and the elderly. The human and emotional impacts are hard to measure, but they will be with us long after we have repaired the built environment. We need to ask ourselves, what have we learned? How can response and relief efforts be more effective so that entire communities can regain a sense of place and community in their lives? This was Sandy's curriculum. What will we change as a result of this experience? How will we educate ourselves and our citizens? Education at all levels will play a critical role in moving forward. Scientists, policymakers, urban planners, social scientists, ministers, and educators need to engage in critical dialogue to create a new curriculum for sustainability. We will have to create interdisciplinary curricula to prepare the next generation of citizens for the challenges that lie ahead. The terms adaptation, resilience, and relief now take on new meaning as we move to a new norm. We can build new buildings, boardwalks, and bridges, But if we do not begin to educate people about sustainability, our ability to adapt and create resilient communities will be severely limited and we will remain a city at risk. We need to learn from this experience and take these hard lessons back to our universities, classrooms, boardrooms, and our communities. This will be the case study that will lead to new knowledge about our city and how best to protect it and the people who live there. It is only through increased environmental literacy across the sectors of society that we can begin to find sensible solutions that will restore and regenerate our urban environment in ways that complement our connections to the natural world. Rather than viewing nature as something we need to protect ourselves from, we need to look at nature as a model and a source of inspiration and innovation in thinking about adaptation and resilience. Einstein aptly noted, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them." I couldn't agree more. We need a curriculum that is more ecocentric, a curriculum that will prepare our students for a world that will require more systems thinking skills, resiliency, and the ability to continually adapt in a changing environment. Sandy was a call to action. It is a most challenging time, but it is also one of the most amazing opportunities we have to put environmental literacy at the forefront of our educational institutions in order to help foster innovation and creativity in building a sustainable city. All of us can play a role in education by moving out of our comfort zone and participating in the process of change and the new norm. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. In that spirit, for our remaining time, I'm going to ask one question to the panel. Whoever wants to take it can dive in, and after that, we will go to questions from the audience. So in the spirit of Mary's remarks, I thought I would ask anyone on the panel who would like to provide an insight or a vision on how education can be used as a tool to get us where we need to be here. It was certainly touched on in several speeches. Certainly Jeremy, Constantine spoke about it, but anyone else who would like to weigh in on it so we can develop that theme?
I think I have to, by obligation to my commitment to CUSP, actually say something. So we actually just developed, after a 9-month process, a new Master of Science in Applied Urban Science and Informatics. It's going to be released, and we're taking applications as of next week, and it's coming out in the fall. It was we engaged faculty from almost every, or at least 5 or 6 different schools at NYU, plus other partner universities. Ray Zimmerman was part of the team that helped put the curriculum together, and really looks at combining these ideas around kind of computer science and data skills with a distinct understanding of the urban context and how cities actually function. And it's inherently multidisciplinary in that students actually come to our program but have to take classes at Wagner or Stern or Courant or Poly. It's a requirement. They're not just electives. And we'll be pulling faculty from all of these different schools as well. And the focus will be on this type of resilience, and adaptation will certainly be an important component of this depending on where the students are focusing. So I think that if anyone is interested, you could check out our new website, which also had just launched, cusp.nyu.edu, and that will be my final plug for the evening. All right.
Great. And I'll throw in a plug in a different direction, which fully endorses what's happening through CUSP, especially, and slowly in many of our different academic programs, as we're seeing an increase in formal education, formal classroom learning that integrates sustainability skills. What I also think, the other place where I see a distinct possibility, where we've only really begun to scratch the surface, is moving out of the classroom as we begin to think about our informal learning communities and universities. And as we think about co-curricular education, residential education, the different places where we are implicitly and sometimes even explicitly teaching, but where we maybe don't have the same level of resources or attention that we're giving the curriculum itself. Jason Lindy, who's in the audience, a student who actually had an op-ed in the Washington Square News that really articulated this very well. But just let me throw you a possibility of what this could look like and how it would have a bearing on something like our ability to respond to the next crisis, the one we haven't named or thought of yet. it's been proposed that we look at our model of employee education in the Sustainability Office, the Sustainability Advocate Program, and not only continue to develop that idea of training our employees in the university to be able to grapple with sustainability issues on the ground, but begin to think about what that would mean for students. What it would mean to have a peer education program that students can draw upon, where they're working with each other, teaching each other, and actually developing skills in terms of leadership, disaster preparedness, volunteer management, the kinds of skills that can come into play the moment a crisis hits. In reality, our untrained and potentially unprepared student body was extraordinarily effective during the hurricane in actually helping in the actual buildings, dealing with crises, volunteering, helping out. But with that kind of a training and that kind of on-the-ground learning, they could have been that much more effective. So I think this idea of leadership training is provocative and is the kind of thing that can harness these informal social networks that we've seen being so critical, but which maybe we haven't fully harnessed. So at an institutional level, that's an opportunity we have going forward, and it could be integrated with the formal education opportunities that our academic programs provide.
Anyone else? Jennifer?
I guess I'm going to speak more to the education and more just the public in general. I think there's a lot of opportunities that we are missing and need to incorporate. Maybe it's at the lower elementary, high school levels, but really start talking about sustainability and making that a normal or the new normal just in building and understanding how everything works and how you can make a difference in simple things like, I don't know, where you get your food or what solar panels actually do. Having that information made available to everybody as a normal thing, I think will also really impact the way things go as we move forward, I guess.
Anyone else? Please.
Yeah, I mean, I would second that. I think the first, sort of significant municipal effort around resilience actually started in King County, and it started out in elementary schools. They started talking to their kids about what they needed to do to save the fish, and I think that salmon runs are important in the Pacific Northwest, and so that really got the whole community sort of involved. So I think that's something we can definitely learn from here in the city. But the second thing is that we're going to be starting a process in the city of sort of an immediate conversation around rebuilding and resilience. And I think that universities play a very important role in sort of helping to facilitate those conversations around really what we can do in the city. And so I think on a more immediate and probably a self-interested point, I hope that we can continue to have forums and listening sessions like this as we move forward, because we're going to be doing a lot of talking in the next 6 months or so.
I just wanted to add that I think it's great that this kind of forum provides an opportunity at an institution like NYU, which is so large, not just to talk to people from other agencies, but to people within NYU and learn about what other departments are doing. And for those of us who are working in teaching, I think it's great to think about ways to collaborate with the Office of Sustainability so that students, not just read about the environment, but maybe can actually go out and see what an institution like NYU is doing in various areas related to environment and sustainability. So.
Terrific. In our remaining 10 minutes or so, I'll be happy to start taking questions from the audience. Now, if I may, because we don't have a microphone set up out there, what I would ask is if you want to stand and briefly ask your question, then I'll repeat it into the microphone for the purpose of our sound system. So I see the gentleman in the back has his hand up. Thank you.
I mean, I'm loud, so I think I'm loud, so I think that they can.
Okay, but it's for the purpose of the sound system. We'll get into the video. So.
My name is Ty Jones. I am a student, and I'm actually studying TV design through OPC. My question is a little slanted. I know that you just said that there's only 341 days left for you guys to be in office. Mayoral elections are coming up, and they're going to be really interesting to watch. And there was a piece that was done last week where the platforms now have to change, where they have to focus more on the infrastructure and sustainable life, and how to combat a lot of the things that Sandy kind of exposed. What do you think the response will be, or what do you think the platforms will look like for the new candidates for next year?
Okay, so I'll just repeat the question for the purpose of our sound system, and that is, with the mayoral election coming up, what will that issue look like in the mayoral campaign for the purpose of mayoral candidates' platforms? Was that directed to Leo or for anyone? Okay. Anyone?
I don't know if I can answer for all the candidates because I work for the current mayor, but I mean, I think unofficially, one of the things that we're going to be really looking to do at the city is to try to set the stage for that to be a big issue in the campaign, because it's a really important one. And I think we're at a unique place right now where, the mayor does have 340 days left, or 341, whatever it is. So it provides the opportunity to really have a very honest and truthful debate. And so I think we're going to be hoping to frame the candidates' race in those terms. I mean, I think you're seeing already, and this is just me saying this, not on behalf of the city, you're seeing it already creep into the conversation. Speaker Quinn gave a big speech sort of laying out what her plan is moving forward, and it included a lot of the types of things that I was just talking about. So, whereas a couple months ago, most of the candidates weren't thinking about this, didn't know what, resilience meant. Now, they've got a 7-point plan to address it. So we're already seeing a lot of progress, I think.
Anyone else?
Yes, I have a question.
Well, I was asking anyone else on the panel want to respond, because no. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Question.
Joyce Silver. I've been listening, and I think that everything that you're saying is very good and very helpful. And going forward, I see a lot of movement. But how do we communicate this to the community? How long is it going to take for them to get to some semblance of normality? How do we deal with what we have right now? And actually be truthful with the population and say, well, it's not going to be 3 months. It's not going to be 6 months. What is it actually going to be? And how do we take care of the people in the meantime?
So I think the question is, again, to repeat it, is how do we communicate this to the wider population in a way that's effective? Is that basically the essence of the question? Anyone?
So, I mean, I think that's a very important point. I think, in terms of dealing with some of the immediate needs and response, the city's been working night and day to try to get people back in their homes. We've had a program which you might have heard of called Rapid Repairs, which is a new way of doing things for the federal government as well as the state. We basically said, we don't want people to be displaced for a long period of time. So what we think is the best way to go about this is to have something called our Rapid Repairs program, where we go out and we work in partnership with FEMA to try to get people back into their homes as quickly as possible. The focus of that work is not to necessarily bring their houses back exactly as they were before, but it's to make them habitable, make sure that they've got heat and hot water. So that's kind of where a lot of the focus is now. The target has been to try to get everybody back in their homes by Christmas. And that's an ambitious goal, but something that we're working towards. And then over the longer term, that's where we'll start to get into a lot of these other things that I've been talking about. So we've got Brad Gare has been named the housing recovery czar, and they're thinking more about long-term recovery. His work is going to span the administration, so that's going to be an 18-month effort, and they're going to be working with Sean Donovan and some of the other folks at the state and federal level that are responsible for the recovery. But I think, beyond affected communities, we need to have a larger conversation about this, and that's some of the work that my office and Seth Pinsky in his new role is really going to be focused on, is going around and thinking about both, what does long-term recovery look like in a comprehensive way in these affected areas, but then also, what should our response be moving forward, knowing that, the climate is changing and that we need to be thinking longer term. So there's going to be, a lot of community discussion around that, and I think it is going to be a challenge to really maintain a sense of urgency around that.
I want to add just one thought to that, because it speaks to this issue of communication. It's not just a matter of getting people back into their homes from this crisis and this event, but it's also a matter of convening the kind of urgency about the climate crisis that is warranted by the scope of the issue we're facing, and that's been a huge challenge. There have been a lot of warnings made already, and of course, though many of you in this room, or most of you in this room, are probably already familiar with the fact that climate change is unfolding as we speak, and that it can be slowed down, and that we have an agency to deal with this. Many people aren't, even in New York City and everywhere else. And as long as that's true, I think the one communication tip I have when I deal with people who are in a position to communicate this message, and when I deal with anybody, is that we've been dealing with a conversation that frames climate change in terms of uncertainty. That is to say that we've been talking about, for example, the statement you'll see in many articles leading up to Sandy, that we can't attribute any one event to climate change with any kind of certainty. We've been talking about uncertainty, what we don't know. And what we need to be doing, because we can't have that certainty, it's not gonna be the alternative. The alternative to climate uncertainty is climate risk. It's a language that's decisively acknowledging that we don't know everything we want to know about this, but that says that we can begin, as Constantine said, to evaluate it, to measure it, to analyze it. And by talking about risk, we can put it in terms that people can actually work with and understand and make decisions about and believe in, which is probably the most important goal we could have here for being able to head off the crisis that we haven't imagined yet.
We are basically out of time, but perhaps we can take one more question. I know some of the panelists may have to leave soon, so just one very quick question. Yes, sir.
So, as has been mentioned towards the end of this little conference, you were all very enthused that you were able to meet and talk together at this moment and sort of cross the boundaries that NYU sometimes has, because we have all these different silos of very strong organizations that don't get to chat with each other. Do you feel that in the coming years you'll be able to develop a communication structure that will better assist with the folks on this table being able to talk to each other when it comes to decision making? Keep in mind that I had to run out of my environmental studies capstone to come here, which means that all the folks who are professors and seniors for the environmental studies department are over there.
Is that a Jeremy question, or?
Could be a few of us, I suppose. 3 of us work here, 4 of us work here. I think it is an ongoing challenge, and it speaks to that need for not only engagement of our community at a grassroots level, which is kind of what I was getting at when I said there's an opportunity with peer reps, with advocate training, with our employees. Those are opportunities to bring the bottom up, I think. There's also a need for engagement at the leadership level in the university, because there's only a few places where all of our bailiwicks meet. That happens in a very small number of situations in a university like this. And in that sense, there is an opportunity for NYU leadership not only to respond fairly aggressively and intelligently about our operational preparedness and how we deal with our infrastructure, but again, to think a little bit more programmatically about how the different parts of the university can be brought together. There is more to be done there. There's more opportunity there, and I hope that the Office of Sustainability can play a role in a conversation that brings those groups together.
Okay. Considering how we are just out of time, do you have time for? What do you think? Time for one more?
You guys antsy? You got time?
Okay, I know. I think Leah has to leave, so if you do, we understand. One more question, then we'll wrap up. Yes, sir.
My name is David Briggs. I'm with Kiwanis by Design in Brooklyn. And I've heard several of you talk about mitigation and adapting. I didn't really hear anybody talk about retreating. You mentioned you were perhaps building new homes, rebuilding homes in Rockaway. I'd be curious to know from the 3 different perspectives that are represented here, so the nonprofit world, we won't be able to get from the government mayoral office, but also from the academic world, discussion that probably should be happening out there, which is, it's a very tough question to ask, and probably a much more difficult question to answer, is whether we really should be rebuilding in some of these areas, given what's happened.
So just let me repeat the question for the sound system, as I think it is important. Do we have a lesson here that certain areas are essentially uninhabitable, and is there a lesson of retreat? And that we may not be happy about that as a lesson, but is that a necessary one from this? Does that fairly well surmise your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone?
Well, I mean, I would say that that's an extremely important question. I think there's been a lot of discussion about the potential for using more natural ecosystems, like restoring wetland ecosystems to prevent a lot of flooding and other kind of effects related to climate change. It's obviously a very big challenge in a dense urban area like the New York metropolitan area. And I would say that, again, the environmental review process, which is now considering climate change adaptation, can provide at least an environmental planning tool to consider whether, not just whether some communities will be rebuilt, but how they will be rebuilt to address some of the challenges of climate change. So I don't think there's a clear-cut answer, but I think there are environmental planning tools that are available to address some of those issues.
As far as architecture for humanity is concerned, we kind of take the stance that it's not really our decision if someone rebuilds or not. That's between the population and the government to decide. So if someone wants to rebuild, like, we're Architecture for Humanity, and we're going to help them do it in the best way possible. If something makes absolutely no sense at all, we're also going to help kind of talk that person off that emotional cliff of just wanting to go back to where they are if it absolutely makes no sense at all. And, we go through the steps of trying to figure out how do you sort of explain to them why it doesn't make sense to go back. But, if somebody wants to be back, we'll be there to help them. And if an organization or an institution wants us to help advise on issues, we're there for that as well. So we don't really have a...
I think I'll just close up here. I think that this is an area where I'm hoping that better information and better data will actually allow us to make better models and more convincing cases about the impacts of all of this, because these individual decisions have collective impacts. I mean, obviously, infrastructure, the first responders who have to respond to the people who are living in these vulnerable areas. So there's costs, societal costs that have to be borne, and we have to do a better job being able to calculate that and make that cost, because I think the initial response is, of course, that the typical response is that we have to rebuild where we are, or the other whatever else won, and we have to kind of get over that emotional kind of immediate knee-jerk response and be able to have a broader conversation of that. And I think that's going to have to get away from some of those kind of visceral responses and get into more of a kind of a data-driven, evidence-based kind of discussion.
Okay, join me in thanking our panelists. I think many of us can hang around if you want to have further discussions, so we'll do it. Thank you.